Okay, well, we're transitioning into a new unit today. This is going to be the last unit that we're going to cover in this class. And instead of focusing on really particular philosophical issues, such as what is the universe made of, what makes an action moral or immoral, what is the ideal form of social and political organization, instead we're going to be looking at some big questions. Namely, how ought you to live your life, given all of the information that we've been looking at so far? So in this final unit, which I've titled Life, Being, and Death, we're going to try to answer the question, what philosophy of life should you follow? What kind of principles or guidelines should you keep in mind in order to live a happy, flourishing, healthy life? And to do that, we're going to start by looking at an Eastern philosophy of life. Namely, we're going to look at Buddhism. So that's what today's class is going to be focused on. Not all of the philosophies of life in this unit are going to be Eastern. The majority of them are actually Western theories. But I kind of like to give a little bit of a balanced view on these things. So first, we're going to look at this one. And to do that, we're going to investigate the philosophy of Stephen Laumakis, who wrote a book on Buddhist philosophy. Here we have a picture of Laumakis. He's an American philosopher, a theologian, somebody who actually works at a university that is just down the street from when I went to college, down the street from McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota. He works at the University of St. Thomas, which is, I believe, a Catholic school, similar to this one. Small kind of Catholic institution. He's known for his medieval philosophy, his book on Buddhism, and Chinese and Eastern philosophy in general. And as we'll see, I think he does a really good job of explaining what Buddhism is trying to get across in its metaphysics, in its ethics, and therefore how we ought to live our lives, at least through an Eastern lens. He's a philosopher of a rare breed who works in comparative philosophy, which is known for comparing different kinds of Eastern and Western theories, comparing, for example, Christianity and Buddhism, or Judaism and Taoism and things like this, comparing different religions and philosophies together, which a lot of philosophers don't often do nowadays. Most of them focus on one thinker or one particular issue and spend their whole lives writing about that. But Laumakis has a vast store of knowledge on both Eastern and Western philosophy. So I think this would be a good introduction to the question that we're trying to answer in this unit, namely, what are you supposed to do with all this information that I've been giving you? Because if you don't know how to live your life, what good is any of this going to do for you? You know, how can you apply the stuff that we've been learning? That's what we're going to try to do in this last stretch of class here. As I noted before, I think a good introduction to philosophies of life is Buddhism, because it's not that hard to understand. It has a different kind of worldview compared to what we grow up learning and being conditioned into in Western society. But I think a lot of it is something that, if y'all can't empathize with it, you can definitely sympathize with it and find some wisdom and some truth in it. Buddhism is an ancient Eastern philosophy. You could even call it a religion if you want. Certainly people engage in certain religious and ritualistic practices surrounding Buddhism. But there are people both in Western countries and Eastern countries that practice it to varying degrees. You don't have to be an ascetic monk living in a monastery somewhere in the mountains in order to be a Buddhist. I actually have a friend who's going to a Buddhist class right now, who is working under a mentor. But Buddhism is based on the teachings of an ancient historical figure named Siddhartha Gautama. Now, the story behind Buddhism revolves around Siddhartha Gautama's life. Born a prince of a noble lord, Siddhartha lived a relatively sheltered and comfortable life. He was born into wealth. He lived in a palace and didn't really leave that palace until his late 20s. And so he was born into wealth. He was surrounded by a lot of luxury and comfort. And he was kind of sheltered from knowledge of the outside world, especially the sufferings of people in the world outside of the palace that he was raised. This kind of upbringing caused Siddhartha to think of the world as, a very kind of beautiful, comfortable, awesome place, where you get to eat the food that you want. You don't have to worry too much about anything. All your needs are cared for. But I believe when he was 27 or 28, kind of around that age range, against his father's wishes, he ended up actually leaving the palace and kind of investigating the world a little bit for himself. And he was astounded, shocked at the experiences that he had outside of the palace. He encountered a sick man, he encountered a dying man, he encountered an old man, and through his conversations with these people and his observations out there in the world, became keenly aware of how much suffering there was actually in the world and how he had been sheltered from that his whole life. And so Siddhartha kind of went on a journey to enlightenment to try to understand the nature of reality and what might be done to ameliorate the suffering that we face in our human lives. Once he attained enlightenment, nirvana, he was then known as the Buddha. This is a title that has been given posthumously to a lot of different figures throughout ancient Chinese history who have attained enlightenment, nirvana, you might say, which literally means to breathe out or exhale, the primary cause of suffering, as we'll see here in a little bit. Buddhism differs from Western philosophy a lot in that one of the things that it's trying to get us to do is reconceptualize what it means to live like a human, and therefore what the nature of reality is like. One of the things that the Buddha is trying to get across in his teachings is that we need to kind of re-understand, actually reflect and come to a better understanding of the nature of humans, of the suffering in life, and what causes the suffering in life. And one of the things that distinguishes a lot of Eastern philosophies from Western philosophy is that Eastern philosophy encourages kind of a detachment from the world. In the West, this is kind of hard for us to imagine and embody. We're caught up in a whole bunch of different things in our lives, right? You're attached to the school in some sense because you're trying to get a degree here. You have all these goals and these dreams that you're pursuing that you want to achieve. You're attached to them in some sense. You're attached to your family members, right? You're invested in their lives. You're invested in a whole bunch of different projects and desires, and you want to see them through. Western philosophies of life generally say attachment is good and fine. You just need to attach yourself to the right thing, whether that's love or whether that's God, whether that is your nation, or whether that's a social cause, feminism or establishing social justice or something like that. In contrast, Eastern philosophies are going to say, no, actually, if you want to live a happy, healthy, flourishing life, it's not about attaching yourself to things and becoming more invested in things. It's about detaching yourself from the world, from worldly desires, from worldly aims. That is how you're going to be able to transcend the suffering of human existence and live a happy, fulfilled life. And so in this book, I think Laumakis does a great job of presenting Buddhism to a Western audience. And he encourages us to think of the Buddha as a doctor in some sense. Not a physical doctor that you might, get surgery from to cure a disease or an ailment, but somebody who is trying to diagnose this condition or this dis-ease that we have in human life and lead them back to health. This leading people back to health is going to be done primarily through our reconceptualization of human life and suffering. Basically a change in outlook rather than a change in physical practice or surgery or something like that. Because the Buddha thinks that once we attain a different outlook, we change our minds, we change our beliefs on some things, that is going to allow us to lead ourselves out of suffering and this cycle of suffering that we are caught up in. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, it's going to get a little difficult here now because I have to present a whole bunch of Eastern concepts to you that you probably haven't thought that much about and are a little foreign to our Western ears. I'm going to start by giving you the Buddhist metaphysics or the Buddhist picture of reality. How Buddhism thinks reality works, how human nature works, what suffering is, and where it comes from. One of the first things that you need to understand about Buddhism, which is pictured here, is the idea of samsara. The Buddhists think that every living thing in existence is caught in this endless cycle of birth, life, suffering, death, and rebirth. They espouse what you might call a reincarnation philosophy. Okay? So the idea is something like everything that lives and dies is caught in this cycle, which is known as samsara. This is how the universe works. The goal in Buddhism is to exit this cycle, get out of this endless cycle that we're caught in. And so they're going to say, depending on your actions in human life, depending on the consequences of your actions, the love that you spread or the lack of love that you spread, how you treat others, that's going to determine, in some sense, what you are reborn as when you die. But they have a kind of a different conception of reincarnation than we do. The way that we in the West think of reincarnation is something like our soul or our essence or our personality remains the same, and it just kind of gets put into different vessels when we become reborn. Eastern philosophy in general doesn't have that same view. They don't think that your soul or your personality, what makes you you, survives, basically, rebirth. Instead, the way one of my professors explained it to me was, it's more so like your life energy, if you imagine as the flame of a candle, lights another candle. And so the flame from the first candle isn't transferred to the second candle, but it is used to light the second one, which then goes on living if the first one gets snuffed out. So the basic idea is we're caught up in this cycle, this reincarnation cycle. And this is not good, okay? Being born, living, suffering, dying, and being reborn is not a fun thing to do. Okay, there's a lot of suffering in human life. And so the more that we go through these cycles, the more suffering there is in existence. So the goal is to exit this cycle in some way. What drives the cycle is known as karma. This is probably a word that you've heard before, right? Especially if you've watched shows like My Name is Earl or something like that. I don't know if y'all are too young to have watched that. But that was a big show when I was younger. Karma, you can basically understand as consequences. The basic idea is something like, with every decision and action that you take, you metaphorically plant a seed, which is going to blossom into something, which is going to have certain consequences. The kinds of consequences that your actions are going to produce are going to be dependent on the kind of seed that you plant, the kind of action that you engaged in. If you engaged in a good action, good consequences are going to blossom from it. If you engaged in a bad action, bad consequences are going to follow from that. And so, what keeps this whole reincarnation cycle going is karma, the consequences of our actions. And so in some sense, what the Buddhist is going to say is we have to reform our actions, we have to reform our outlook so that we produce less consequences, less bad consequences that drive the cycle onward and upward. Okay? They're going to say that our actions, and therefore the consequences of our actions, are fueled by desire, or what they refer to as dukkha. And as we'll see in Buddhist philosophy, one of the primary aims is the elimination of desire. The way that they conceptualize the universe is the reason that we do what we do is because we have desires for things. Why are you sitting in this classroom? Because you have a desire to be here. Maybe not a strong desire, but a desire nonetheless. Why do you eat food? And therefore, why do farms have to produce food? And why do animals have to be farmed and caged? Because you have a desire for food. There's this need, this desire that we have. And so the Buddha is going to be big on transforming our relationship with our desires. Because it's desire that causes us to act in these ways that keep the whole cycle going. Another central concept in Buddhism, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation here, which is known as Pratitya Samutpada, is a strange view, one that we're not used to really thinking about in Western society. Because of the rise of science and the rise of education and all of these concepts and ways of life that we are living and embodying in Western culture, we tend to think of things as separate and distinct, right? This chair is a separate thing than this table. You are a separate thing compared to the person next to you, right? And the language that we use, the concepts that we use, imply that all of these different things in the universe have its own essence to it. Right? This chair is not this chair because they're two different things. They're not the same thing. This is how we categorize things, and this is how we talk about things in Western culture. But this is not how Eastern thinkers understand the world. The way that they understand things in the universe and humans and persons and organisms is that each thing is what it is because of its relationship with everything else. So the Buddhist would say something like, this chair is not a distinct thing separate from everything else around it. Rather, this chair is what it is, and what this chair means to us is caused by the fact that this chair is in relationship with every other thing in the universe. And so in some sense, the essence of this chair is informed by everything else. We know that this is a chair because it's not exactly the same thing as this thing, but we know that what a chair is in relation to this thing, so we can make sense of the chair because we know what tables are. We can make sense of what laptops are because we understand that they're made of components in a kind of relationship with one another. It's a strange view, but to summarize it, it's the idea that events, things, happenings are all causally conditioned by and dependent on one another. To really understand a thing, you can't take it as its own thing separate from everything else. Rather, it's kind of as if all things are mutually arising and coming to exist at the same time. And everything is in relation with everything else. So, nothing has a distinct, separate essence. It doesn't make sense to talk about this chair or that water bottle separately. Rather, what that thing is causally conditioned by what everything else is. And so you can imagine each thing in the universe as being a node in a complex web or a complex network of interconnectedness. This is a weird idea. I know, it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around. In Taoism, this is known as mutually arising. All things are kind of mutually arising together, and what makes them what they are is the fact that they're in relationship with everything else. And everything is connected. That's how you can understand it. Everything is connected. Okay? This leads into their idea or their conception of personal identity. We like to think of personal identity in the West as each of us has a unique personal identity that is kind of like unchanged and remains stable and fixed throughout your life. This is what allows us to say things like, the person in the baby picture, in your baby picture, is the same person that you are today, right? Or in Judaism or Christianity, everybody has a unique soul that is specific to them, and nobody has the soul of another person. You have what makes you you, and that's what makes you you, and nothing else makes you you. Well, the Buddhists don't believe in the idea of a fixed, unchanging, permanent self. This concept, known as anatman, literally means no self. It's the idea that humans are what they are in relation to everything else. Again, they're not distinct from everything else. They're in relationship with everything else. But that actually what a human is, what a person is something like a collection of processes, a collection of parts, a collection of happenings. So you don't have, according to the Buddhists, a fixed, permanent, unchanging essence that persists through time. Rather, you are constantly in flux. And we kind of know this, right? Through biology and chemistry and physics. They say every 7 years, right, all the cells in your body are replaced. The Buddhists are going to say, yeah, that's actually kind of true. Like, you're a collection of processes, a collection of changing things. What makes you you is not some stable, permanent, unchanging thing that exists through time. There is no such thing like that. And this arises out of their concept of pratitya samutpada. And so the picture that I've included here is kind of meant to illustrate that just as we embody a lot of different roles in society, so too what we might say ontologically, which is to say your being is not a fixed thing. It is a collection of a bunch of parts and changing processes that are ongoing. You are not a soul, as the Christians would say, according to Buddhism. You're just a collection of these different changing processes. Okay, we good so far? All of this is going to be relevant, I promise. Where Buddhism comes into the picture with regards to this class is the philosophy of life that it offers. And in order to understand the kind of principles that Buddhism thinks that you should live by, you first need to understand their conception of the world and what it's like to live as a human. These are distilled into what are called the Four Noble Truths. The first truth is known as the truth of suffering. Suffering exists in the world, and humans experience it and contribute to it. You don't need a magical wizard or philosophy professor to tell you that you suffer in your life, right? That everybody suffers in their lives, right? Maybe some people have less suffering and some people have more suffering. But an intrinsic part of human life is suffering. This is the first thing that the Buddhist is going to say. And not only that, not only is suffering a part of life, but humans experience it, organisms experience it, and with our actions, we contribute to it. And you've known this because you've hurt people in your life, right? And people have hurt you. Through your actions, through your words, through your postings on social media, whatever it is. People contribute to your suffering, you contribute to people's suffering, even though you don't want to do that, right? This is just kind of how life works. And so the first noble truth is just that. Suffering exists in the universe. Humans experience it, contribute to it, and that's bad. Okay, suffering ain't good. The second truth explains to us that there is actually a cause to this suffering. Okay, there's a reason that suffering exists in the universe. And they locate the cause. Buddhism says that this suffering is fueled by ignorance of our own condition, ignorance of what we're doing, ignorance of the world, and by desire, tanha, or what you might call possessiveness or selfish wanting for things. So the reason why we cause others to suffer, other people cause us to suffer, the reason that we suffer in general, from natural disasters, from weird events, is because we have desires that we're trying to fulfill. And we suffer when we're not able to satisfy those desires. So you suffer when you're hungry because you have a desire for food. You suffer when your boyfriend isn't being nice to you because you have a desire for security and a desire to be wanted and accepted. Right? You suffer in society, if you're a member of a minority group, for instance, because society doesn't accept you and you want to be accepted and tolerated and loved. So we experience suffering, but all of the suffering that we see around us is made possible only because organisms have desires for things. So somehow, if we could figure out how to transcend our own desires, we would no longer have our expectations dashed by anything. Right? If somehow you could give up your desire for food, you wouldn't feel the pains of hunger. If you could somehow give up your desire for security, you wouldn't feel the suffering that's involved when your life isn't secure. Right? When people don't affirm you. Whatever it is. And what they mean by desire is desire in the general sense, but like every desire, right? Desire for sex, desire for certain psychological things, desire for shelter, food, warmth, water, whatever it is. Suffering is fueled by desire at the end of the day. But the good news is that we don't have to stay trapped and enslaved by our desires. We are not determined to perpetuate the cycle of suffering. And this is where truths 3 and 4 come in. Suffering can be abolished. Suffering can end. This is known as the truth of the end of suffering. Suffering, also known as dukkha, can be eliminated through the elimination of desire. Tanha. That is, getting rid of desire, craving, the attachments that you have to things in this world will allow us to escape suffering. And you kind of know this intuitively already. If someone is saying something bad about you, or somebody, has a bad opinion of you, what kind of advice do your parents give? You're all hemming and hawing and upset because Jamie over in HR doesn't like you. What kind of advice do they normally give you to escape this suffering that you're in? Yeah, stop giving a shit about what other people think about you, right? Just stop putting your eggs in that basket. Right? There's the same idea is going on here. Right? If you want to eliminate the suffering of your expectations being dashed, the sufferings of not getting what you want in life, just get rid of those desires. Get rid of those expectations. Get rid of your intense attachment and investment in all of this stuff. Learn to go more with the flow and take life as it is, rather than trying to impose your will on the world and make the world as you see fit. Right? Yeah. So we can escape suffering by eliminating our desires, by transcending our attachments and our cravings for things. This leads into the fourth noble truth, which leads into what we might call the Buddhist's real philosophy of life, which is escaping suffering by eliminating or transcending desire is done through what is called the Noble Eightfold Path. There are 8 things that we can work on or cultivate in order to eliminate our desires and our attachments to things in life. It's not easy. It's going to require some work. It's going to require a transformation on your part. But Buddhism stipulates that your suffering can be eliminated, if not diminished a lot, if you change your outlook, if you change your speech, if you change your actions, and if you show up in your relationships with people, spreading love and compassion. This is an image of all of the elements of the Eightfold Path. This path out of suffering to liberation to nirvana, enlightenment. Buddhism says that if you want to escape suffering, if you want to eliminate desire, what you need to do is cultivate right or appropriate view, thought, speech, action, a good livelihood, a moral livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And we'll go through each of these here in a little bit. This is kind of a general picture, a general overview of what the Buddhists think we should be doing in order to eliminate desire and therefore escape our suffering. Like Aristotle's virtue theory, the Buddhists are going to say that all of these things that we need to be working on are mutually dependent on one another and reinforcing. So once you fix your view of the world, once you change your outlook, and once you change your thought, that is going to lead you to changing your speech. And it's also going to lead you to changing how you act in the world. It's going to cause you to act for the better. It's going to cause you to act in ways that is going to allow you to detach from all of this meaningless stuff. All of this stuff that you're invested in that is causing you real pain. And so what the Buddhist is trying to get us to do is engage in an ongoing process of transformation. Transforming our outlook, thoughts, words, actions, and our relationships with others for the better. We need to be engaged in this ongoing transformational process where we're trying to do better each day, where we're trying to think better thoughts, say nicer things, spread more compassion and love. And so reaching enlightenment, which comes about through the elimination of desire, isn't going to be something like an on-off switch where one day you're not enlightened and then all of a sudden next day you're enlightened. It's more like a process. We're all in different stages of our journey. Okay? But it is up to each one of us in order to cultivate these different elements so that we can live a less sufferable life. This is work that we have to do. Okay? And the world isn't fair. The world sucks. But at the end of the day, Buddhism is going to say that if you want to escape suffering, you got to take the wheel. Okay? You got to do some real work on yourself. Even though people suck and even though there's injustice. And so how do you actually do this? How do you cultivate appropriate view, thought, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, concentration? How do you do that? Well, the Buddhists talk about this in a lot of different texts. Here's kind of a general picture. Buddhism is going to say that to eliminate desire, to escape suffering, we must commit ourselves to Buddhist philosophy. We need to direct our thoughts and emotions to what is called the middle way, which I'll explain here in a bit. We need to employ appropriate speech. We need to stop being mean and insulting to people. and impatient and harsh with our words. We got to say nice things, respectful, loving things. We need to act morally, which is to say, no killing, no lying, no torturing animals, no getting revenge on people, but spreading love and compassion and respect, okay, and doing best to reflect that in our actions. We need to engage in a job that is moral. So, for example, they would say, you can't be a mercenary. Okay, a mercenary, somebody who is paid to kill people, or an assassin or something like that, is not going to allow you to cultivate these different elements. You need to make sure that what you're doing for your livelihood is moral, or as moral as it can be, let's say in our Western society. We also need to be fully committed and mindful to our own development along this path. So checking in with ourselves where we might be failing, what we can improve upon, what we can do better, how we're applying these principles and how we might be doing that wrong, checking in with the ancient texts to monitor our thoughts, speech, and behavior to make sure that we're doing it right. We need to be mindful of this process. We need to hold it as our top priority, and we need to act it out. And so to do this, it's going to involve continuously cultivating motivation to proceed along the path, even though it's going to be hard, even though it's not going to be fair, even though people might look at you silly. Okay? And we need to cultivate a mental awareness of our own condition, of other people's conditions, of our progress. Again, where we're falling short, how we can do better. And finally, cultivate a certain calmness and collectedness about the situations and the events that occur to us in life. Not flying off the handle when something happens that you didn't want to happen, but cultivating kind of a calm, cool collectedness, in which in some sense you accept what happens in the world without raging against it, without breaking down and crying at every second. Cultivating mental and physical fortitude and endurance. Being able to act under pressure. Being able to not skip right to judgment of other people, but be patient and respectful. Now, in this little guide, there was an allusion to the middle way. The middle way is another way of reformulating what this path is supposed to look like to us. Okay? The Buddha, on his journey to enlightenment, on his journey to eliminate desire and therefore escape suffering, tried out a whole bunch of different things. Before he was ever on this journey, he lived a life of luxury and pleasure, right? He lived a life in a wealthy palace. He had all the food that he wanted. He could call women to dance in front of him if he wanted, court dancers and things. He had nice pillows, a nice bed, all of these sensuous pleasures, okay, he could engage in if he wanted to, and he did. When he set out on his path towards enlightenment, he thought, maybe I should leave all that stuff behind. Maybe I should fast. Maybe I should not engage in any sex. Maybe I should not engage in any lustful thoughts. Maybe I should try to abstain from eating and drinking as much as I can. Abstain from luxuries. Live a more ascetic life. But what he found in his journey is that not only did abstaining from everything not work for him, it didn't seem to be working out for any of the other monks or enlightened people during his time either. He didn't think that they had really achieved fulfillment or happiness by forsaking everything and trying to live the most ascetic life possible. So, in his speeches, in his lessons to his students, he said that we need to actually live out kind of a more balanced way of life between sensuous pleasure and pure abstaining from everything. A middle way between these two extremes. And this comes in a lot of different flavors depending on how you want to think about it. Morally, we would say the Buddha would advocate for taking a middle way between hedonism, which is living life just geared towards pleasure as your top priority, not doing that, but also not living a pure ascetic life, what we might characterize as complete deprivation. So you don't want to be someone constantly looking for sex and drugs and rock and roll, but you also don't want to be someone who deprives yourself of everything of this world. Neither one of these extremes is going to allow you to eliminate desire and escape suffering. You have to live a more balanced life, a life kind of in the middle between these two things. That's the moral dimension of this middle way. The epistemological dimension, or the knowledge dimension, has to do with what the Buddha says we should be thinking about and believing in. We shouldn't remain completely ignorant of the world. We shouldn't seek after ignorance. Nor should we just latch on to conventional belief. We shouldn't just accept what everybody tells us. Okay? We shouldn't just accept as gospel everything our parents or our aunts or our society teaches and preaches. Okay? The middle way between these two extremes is actually true, correct knowledge of how the world works. Not knowing nothing, but not just accepting everything as true. But kind of working things out, right? Reflecting on things. Basing things off of your experiences and what you've come to know. And finally, if we want to get a little mystical with it, a little weird, we could say there's also a metaphysical dimension to this middle way, which is living between the extremes of non-being and being, of nothingness and fullness. Rather, we shouldn't be focused on becoming nothing or becoming a static, unchanged, fixed thing. We should be working on a life in the middle of those two things, engaged in a process of becoming more enlightened, becoming more moral. Remember, the Buddhists think that each person is a collection of different processes. And so the way that we ought to live our life also should be a process in some sense. Constantly improving, constantly reflecting and being mindful of where we are on the path. Constantly trying to better ourselves. Constantly trying to be more compassionate and patient with people. It's unlikely that we're ever going to reach the end of that road, right? Where we're completely 100% patient and loving and honest. It's something that we have to work towards, right? I doubt any of us are going to become the perfect person at the end of our lives, right? So we need to just focus on becoming better. It's a process. And so the Buddha is going to say, neither the hedonistic lifestyle, the lifestyle focused on pleasure, nor the ascetic lifestyle is ultimately fulfilling, rewarding, or able to allow us to live flourishing lives. Okay? We must live a balanced life of wisdom engaged in a process of betterment. Does this sound similar to any Western view we've looked at so far in this class? Think back to our second unit. Who does this sound like to you? Our unit on ethics. Who's all about bettering yourself? Getting stronger, getting wiser. Yeah, Aristotle, perfect. Yeah. You can kind of understand a lot of what the Buddhists are saying kind of through an Aristotelian lens, right? Both Aristotle's view of the good life and the Buddhist's view of the good life is that we need to work on ourselves, we need to change our mindset, change our habits. That is what is going to allow us to be happy. But ideally for the Buddhists, what they would say is, once you've gone far enough along on this path, what will happen is you will escape from the clutches of your desires, and you will be able to exit the cycle entirely, and you won't be reborn. You won't be reincarnated. This process might take several reincarnations to accomplish, but it's something that we need to keep working towards. And so always we must be concerned with how we can better ourselves, how we can be following Buddhism more correctly and more efficiently. In essence, you could kind of boil Buddhism down to, don't be a dick, be a compassionate, loving, respectful, patient person who's trying to become better. That's basically the philosophy of life that is being offered here. And so what I'd like to do now is just play a brief video for you, kind of summarizing some of these views. And then let's talk about it. Let's see what y'all have to say.
The story of Buddhism, like all of Buddhism, is a story about confronting suffering. He was born sometime between the 6th and 4th century BC, the son of a wealthy king in the Himalayan foothills of Nepal. It was prophesied that the young Buddha, then called Siddhartha Gautama, would either become the emperor of India or a very holy man. Since Siddhartha's father desperately wanted him to become the former, he kept the child isolated in a palace. Young Gautama had every imaginable luxury: jewels, servants, lotus ponds, even beautiful dancing women. For 29 years, Gautama lived in bliss, protected from the smallest misfortunes of the outside world. But then he left the palace for short excursions. What he saw amazed him. First he met a sick man, then an aging man, and then a dying man. He was astounded to discover that these unfortunate people represented normal, indeed inevitable parts of the human condition that would one day touch him too. Horrified and fascinated, Gautama made a fourth trip outside the palace walls and encountered a holy man who'd learned to seek spiritual life in the midst of the vastness of human suffering. Inspired by the holy man, Gautama left the palace for good. He tried to learn from other holy men. He almost starved himself to death by avoiding all physical comforts and pleasures, as they did. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it didn't bring him solace from suffering. Then he thought of a moment when he was a small boy. Sitting by the river, he noticed that when the grass was cut, the insects and their eggs were trampled and destroyed. As a child, he felt a deep compassion for the tiny insects. Reflecting on his childhood compassion, Gautama felt a profound sense of peace. He ate, meditated, and finally reached the highest state of enlightenment, nirvana. It refers to the blowing out of the flames of desire. With this, Gautama had become the Buddha, the awakened one. The Buddha awoke by recognizing that all of creation, from distraught ants to dying human beings, is unified by suffering. Recognizing this, the Buddha discovered how to best approach suffering. First, one shouldn't bathe in luxury, nor abstain from food and comforts altogether. Instead, one ought to live in moderation. The Buddha called this the middle way. This allows the maximal concentration on cultivating compassion for others and seeking enlightenment. Next, the Buddha described a path transcending suffering, called the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is the realization that first prompted the Buddha's journey, that there is suffering and constant dissatisfaction in the world. The second is that this suffering is caused by our desires. As the Buddha said, attachment is the root of all suffering. The third truth is that we can transcend suffering by removing or managing these desires. The Buddha thus made the remarkable claim that we must change our outlook, not our circumstances. We are unhappy not because we don't have enough money, love, or status, but because we're greedy, vain, and insecure. By reorienting our minds, we can grow to be content. With the correct behavior and what we now term a mindful attitude, we can also become better people. We can invert negative emotions and states of mind, turning ignorance into wisdom, anger into compassion, and greed into generosity. The fourth and final noble truth the Buddha uncovered is that we can learn to move beyond suffering through what he termed The Eightfold Path involves a series of aspects of behaving right and wisely. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. What strikes the Western observer is the notion that wisdom is a habit, not merely an intellectual realization. One must exercise one's nobler impulses on a regular basis, as one would train a limb. The moment of understanding is only one part of becoming a better person. After his death, the Buddha's followers collected his sutras, sermons or sayings, into scripture, and developed texts to guide followers in meditation, ethics, and mindful living. The monasteries that had developed during the Buddha's lifetime grew and multiplied throughout China and East Asia. For a time, Buddhism was particularly uncommon in India itself, and only a few quiet groups of yellow-clad monks and nuns roamed the countryside, meditating quietly in nature. But then, in the 3rd century BC, an Indian king named Ashoka grew troubled by the wars he had fought and converted to Buddhism. He sent monks and nuns far and wide to spread the practice. Buddhist spiritual traditions spread across Asia and eventually throughout the world. Buddha's followers divided into two main schools, Theravada Buddhism, which colonized Southeast Asia, and Mahayana Buddhism, which took hold in China and Northeast Asia. Today, there are between 0.5 and 1.5 billion Buddhists in both East and West, following the Buddha's teachings and seeking a more enlightened and compassionate state of mind. Intriguingly, the Buddha's teachings are important regardless of our spiritual identification. Like the Buddha, we're all born into the world, not realizing how much suffering it contains, and unable to fully comprehend that misfortune, sickness, and death will come to us too. As we grow older, this reality often feels overwhelming, and we may seek to avoid it altogether. But the Buddha's teachings remind us of the importance of facing suffering directly. We must do our best to liberate ourselves from the grip of our own desires, and recognize that suffering can be viewed as part of our common connection with others, spurring us to compassion and gentleness.
Okay. So now I'd like you to speak to the people next to you. What do you think about this view? You think it gets some things right? What do you like about it? What do you dislike about it? Talk amongst yourselves a little bit, and then we'll have a big conversation.
I mean, he should be there, but like, I feel like I'm gonna end up doing exactly what he's doing, signing up for everything, just kind of being there when I can. Well, I don't know. Right? I don't know how you can without the
Okay, let's bring it back in. What do you all think of this view? Share your thoughts with me. Marissa, what did Ben say?
Well, both of us kind of said that like this view made more sense compared to other things because it actually focused on moderation and instead of just all or nothing.
And you like that?
Yeah.
You think the life that seeks only after pleasure isn't good, and neither is the life of complete deprivation?
Yeah.
But kind of like a moderate thing, like Aristotle advocates for, right? Moderation. Okay. Ben, what did Marissa say?
The exact same thing.
Anything else?
Not really. She just said she's heard this talk 3 times in her
In
college
3
career.
separate classes.
Oh, okay. So you're already familiar with this. Okay. Okay, what did the rest of y'all think? Yeah, Aurora.
I got a question.
Okay.
If you're taken out of the circle, what happens next? Like you finish, you completed it, like where do you go after that?
That's a good question. So it's going to kind of vary depending on the Buddhist sect that you follow. But I think some of them think it's just like eternal nothingness. You're done. You're gone. You don't have to deal with the sufferings of life anymore. Like the eternal sleep of death. Right? Isn't that a nice way of putting it, or does that sound sad?
Scary.
It sounds scary? Why?
You can put it in a way like it's just relaxation.
Yeah, you're just like, you're sitting in a sensory deprivation tank for infinite.
You never have to wait in the line again.
You don't have to wait in the line again. You don't have to hear people shout slurs at your friends. You don't have to you don't have to have the internal battle of, oh, it's so cozy in my bed, but I also have to pee. Am I going to get up? Or am I going to... Don't have to worry about that anymore. What do the rest of y'all think? Do you like this view? Are y'all going to start becoming Buddhists today? I see some shaking of heads. Why not? Is there anything that you disagree with?
I like this view, but I feel like not everyone could be able to follow it because of like attachments to things, like addictions and things like that. Unless they really break off those habits, but if not, they won't be able to let go of those desires.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's clear that the majority of people that are going to die during our lifetime are not going to be able to escape this cycle. Yeah, people have addictions. People have desires for pleasure, desires to be wanted and loved and all this stuff. But do you think your life would be better if you stopped caring about all that? Yeah? What about you, Jordan? You shaking? Do you feel like your desires cause you to suffer?
Yeah, like I feel like if you're just really attached to something, it's like a bad thing.
Is there anything that you're attached to that causes suffering? Maybe family members? Right? Or, I don't know, getting a good grade in class? If you're attached to that, and you have a mean old professor, right? That causes you suffering. Right? What if you just stop caring about your grades? Stop caring about what people thought about you and said about you? Wouldn't you be happier? Yeah.
With the 8-12 path, like one of the hardest ones for like a modern day use of this is like the job. I don't know which one that is.
Yeah, 5 or something.
I think. Because it's really like if you look at jobs and you look at like the truths of Buddhism, it's extremely hard to find a job that that can be sustainable to live off, but also apply into what Buddhism stands for. So like you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, I feel like.
You don't think there are any jobs in Western society that are moral? Or are we all kind of getting our hands dirty in everything in any job?
Well, every business is about making money.
True. Yeah. And you might say that, like, look, the majority, if not all, of the jobs in Western society cause you to get your hands dirty. Right? Let's say you're a high schooler and you decided to get a part-time job at Burger King. Well, is Burger King the company the most moral company? Are they engaged in environmentally sustainable practices? Do they engage in factory farming? Do they buy food from factory farmers that cause animal suffering? That give them growth hormones, chicken growth hormones, so that they can't even stand up for more than a few seconds? You know? A good question you might have is it actually possible to work a job that doesn't contribute to suffering in Western society?
I feel like the one of two things was, first thing is like, you get a job, you aren't aware that it's immoral.
Yeah.
You know, and you still get it anyway, and then you find out later like what it's doing. You know, talking about like businesses in the news, like Amazon did this, and something like that, and that's what I think about that. But the second thing, I don't remember the second thing, it's fine.
Sometimes I feel like maybe there is no winning when it comes to a job that we might take. I was just criticized the other day for being an adjunct professor. Why? Well, if all adjunct professors stopped accepting positions, wouldn't adjunct professors get paid more? And they wouldn't have to live out of their cars? So I'm contributing to this system that keeps the wage down, that makes it unlivable for people. Isn't this kind of how people talk nowadays, right? You contribute to a system that oppresses or discriminates, right? Is there any way to not do that? It's a good question.
At that point, it'd just be all or nothing, if that makes sense.
Could you explain a little bit?
What did you just say before?
Oh, talking about by taking on these adjunct positions, I'm contributing to a system that keeps wages down, right? And makes it so that adjuncts can't live without multiple jobs, right?
But that specifically, like them telling you you can't have that job. It's like, okay, so is that person also not allowed to? And that person also wants to be a professor? It's an all or nothing thing. It's like either they're allowed to and everyone can, or no one can.
Right, yeah. The person that I was speaking to advocated for, all the adjuncts should just quit and not accept any jobs, and then the system will get better.
Where are the teachers then? Like, where are the teachers? Who's going to teach?
Well, I guess the picture is that colleges will wise up and they'll start paying their adjuncts more, and then the adjuncts will come back. Right? But I don't know, maybe that's a rosy, idealistic picture.
I really wonder where all that tuition goes sometimes.
Not to me.
I don't know where it goes. I don't know where it goes.
Who knows? Well, is there anybody who dislikes this view or has some problems with it? Don't be shy. It's okay to dislike this. Does anybody have a problem with it? Or see a weakness in it?
I feel like sometimes you just, even if you like follow the ways, you can't really escape like suffering. Like I feel like even if you do like go the middle way and all that, like suffering still would happen.
So you think suffering's kind of inevitable anyway?
Yeah.
Yeah? Anything else?
Being able to get over underlying conditions that could cause you to suffer, like if you were born with a disability, how are you able to get over that disability specifically, but except by working on it and getting over it throughout your life and just working on it and being like, this is who I am and I am okay with it, but that can also cause suffering in itself.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's a really hard hurdle with this that you have to get over. It's like, I am this thing and I can't change that.
Yeah. One of the big things that Buddhists advocate for is we have to change our outlook, right? If we want to be happy and if we want to escape suffering. But a legitimate critique is, look, changing your outlook isn't going to make the suffering go away all the time. Right? I can change my view on, what society is like or what the universe is like, but I'll still feel pain. Right? And maybe I might have an underlying condition that causes me suffering, and no change of outlook is going to deal with that, right? Especially if I have a chemical deficiency or a deficiency of some neurotransmitter, right? Changing outlook isn't going to help that. There are a lot of things that we could ask when discussing this philosophy of life. We might question the fundamental assumption, is it true that desire leads to suffering? Or is it possible that, if we just modified our desires, if we just desired the right things, we wouldn't suffer? Do we have to get rid of desire entirely? Is desire really that bad? Another thing we might ask is, should we buy this picture of reincarnation that the Buddhist is giving to us? How many of you here believe in reincarnation? It's not something that we really, have a lot of belief or faith in, right, in Western society. And if we don't believe that primary metaphysical picture, well, who's to say the rest of it is right? Or applicable to our lives? Maybe there's a better path out there, right? And finally, we might ask, is it possible to follow this philosophy of life while living in Western society? One thing that we brought up was jobs, right? The Buddha says we need to work a moral job. Well, is it possible to do that in the U.S.? Are there any jobs in which you don't get your hands dirty? Is it possible for us, because of the way that we've been conditioned, because of our upbringing, because of our culture, is it possible for us to stop desiring things and stop having attachments to things? The lifestyle that this Buddhist philosophy kind of gives us is something like detaching yourself from all of the cares and things in the world. But is that possible for us? Is that actually going to be good? Do you want to become detached from the sufferings of your significant other? Or the sufferings of your family? Maybe you think that's a good thing, right? Maybe you want to be invested in a relationship. Maybe you want to be invested in a purpose or a life goal. Is that so bad? Is it possible for us not to become invested like that? And this leads to perhaps a fundamental paradox of following this life philosophy. And this is actually different versions of this paradox I've found in almost all Eastern philosophies. Insofar as Buddhism and Taoism encourage detachment from the world, what does that say about our relationship to this philosophy of life? We're supposed to eliminate desire. Does that mean eliminating the desire to escape suffering? And if so, where's our motivation to, follow this then? We're supposed to eliminate desire, but it would seem like we would follow this view because we want to get out of suffering, but we can't want, right? We're not supposed to want, so what are we supposed to do about that? It's a similar thing with Taoism. I really like Buddhism and Taoism, actually, but Taoism implies, infamously, that the way that we ought to live our lives is just to go with the flow, to not become invested, to detach ourselves from things. But you can't intentionally be a Taoist. Because if you're trying to intentionally do something, you're not going with the flow. Right? And so you can't intentionally be a Taoist. It doesn't seem like you can eliminate desire entirely, at least not the desire to not want to suffer. So I don't know, it's kind of tricky. Like, how do we square all that? It's difficult. In any case, I think there's a lot of cool things here. I would encourage you all to reflect on them. Ask your friends what they think about all this. Have conversations about this, okay? You will get better at figuring out what it is that you believe and the kind of life path that you want to take the more you think and talk about this stuff. So do that outside of class, all right? Okay. Thank you. I will see you all on Thursday.